transition into that season where we start to celebrate the coming of Jesus. And what I want us to really think about is, how does Christian hope, how is it distinguished from the kind of, I call it generic, the generic Christmas season hope that we see around us? You guys maybe know what I'm talking about if you go home, and some of you may, like our family, have started Christmas movies and Christmas music a little early, but if not, I challenge you to go home, pull up Netflix or Disney, whatever you watch your movies on, and look at the descriptions of the movie. And just about every description says something similar, like, big city girl visits the country and finds out the true meaning of Christmas, right? Or you look at we saw one this week we were reading, it's Mickey and his friends find out the true meaning of Christmas. The Grinch finds out the true meaning of Christmas. But what's interesting is when you watch the movies or you read the stories or listen to the songs, what you'll find is there's kind of a generic, like every movie has a different meaning of Christmas, right? They're all saying that this is the true meaning of Christmas. But you get to the end of the story, and some of the true meaning of Christmas on the Hallmark Christmas movies is true love, and some of the kids' movies, it's, charity and like A Christmas Carol, being more generous. And so there's this generic sense of hope that is around our culture in the season of Christmas, where people sing about hope and they sing about joy and they sing about happiness. But I want to ask you this morning to consider what distinguishes how Christians celebrate Jesus' arrival from the general sense of hope that seems to be around us in our culture, and how can we as Christians help articulate to the world around us why it's such a big deal that we celebrate Jesus' coming. And so to kind of help us transition to that, I want us to read together Psalm 39, and we're going to work through it rather than reading it all at once. We're going to work through it in sections this morning, because what I want us to see is just three things. We're going to see, number one, the need for hope, why it is that every human being feels this sense in their heart that they want to hope for something. Then we're going to talk about the thrill of hope. We're going to define how our hope that Jesus has come into the world does distinguish us from the hopes of the world. And then finally, we're going to talk about the result of hope, how the hope that we have in Jesus Christ, based on what he has done, changes our lives and allows us to be people filled with hope, not just at Christmas, but year-round. So I want to invite you, if you will, like I said, we'll be in Psalm 39, and I'm going to start in the first 6 verses, and we're going to see the need for hope. This is a psalm of David. We don't know exactly when David wrote this, but we know he's in a time of testing and trial, potentially because he feels like he's under the discipline of the Lord for his own sins. So this is how Psalm 39 begins. I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle so long as the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue, O Lord, make me know my end and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. So I want us to start by talking about the need for hope. I think what David, the emotions and feelings that he's expressing in this, really could be summed up with this. He feels a distance from God. And the reality is, the further you are from God, the more distant you feel from God, the more you have this question in your heart, what's my end? He says this in verse 4, if you want to highlight that. Oh Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. You say, Jared, this doesn't really seem like an uplifting and encouraging Christmas sermon just yet, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But the reality of this is we have to recognize that the first distinguishing marker of Christian hope is that we recognize that the greater distance there is between man and God, the more desperate the situation is. And David recognizes this because there's a distance between my heart and your heart, God, in this moment. He's asking those big questions, and every human has this question, right? Make me know my end. What's the measure of my day? Let me know how fleeting I am. And then you see, even in verse 6, such a man goes about as shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. What is my end? What is my purpose in life? This is the reality of the question, helps us think through why every human being wants to hope in something. We want to hope that there's more to life than just the pain that we're experiencing in the moment. And this is, again, why it's so important that you understand that there is a distinction and a difference between how we as Christians hope and what we're waiting on and what the world does. Because when we think through the generic hope of the world, what we really come to, and we've talked about this throughout the years, we've talked about what it means to be filled with hope, is that the world's best hope is really just wishful thinking. The world's best hope, because it's generic and non-specific and it's kind of up in the air, is that maybe things will turn out better than they are right now. But when you really think about that, if you play it out with a hopeless person like David is right now, you ask that question and they say, what's the need? What's the end of this life? What's the purpose? What's the value? Why is there so much turmoil in our lives? Why does it seem like so much is going wrong? And David even says, surely a man grabs wealth and doesn't know who will gather it. What David is saying is the reality is this: if you don't have specific hope in the promises of God, then you play your hope out, and the best that you can come up with is wishful thinking. The best you can come up with is the meaning of Christmas is that we all feel happy at the end of Christmas. And I want to illustrate this with A Christmas Carol. If you remember the story of A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge, and he's the bad guy. He's a bad guy, and he's greedy, and he hoards all his money, and he makes his workers work, and everybody's suffering around him because of his choices. And so he has this famous night, Christmas Eve, right, where he's visited by three spirits, or three ghosts. He has the ghost of Christmas past who comes and shows him, hey, here's why you're in the situation you're in. Here's the circumstances that have led you to be this, cold-hearted, mean kind of guy. And then the ghost of Christmas present comes, and the ghost of Christmas present comes and shows him, here's how other people are talking about you, how other people think about you. Here's how your choices are causing other people to be oppressed and to suffer. And then finally, the third ghost that visits Ebenezer Scrooge is the ghost of Christmas future. And he comes, and what does he show Ebenezer? He shows him his end, right? David in the psalm cries out, what's my end? And the ghost of Christmas future comes and says, Ebenezer, this is your end. This is your punishment. And I remember growing up, I don't remember exactly which movie or retelling of the story it is, but I think it may have been Disney, because I think I have this vivid memory of like Goofy looking at a gravestone, which is such a weird thing for a kid to be thinking through. But you remember that gravestone. That picture of this is the end. This is where you're headed, Ebenezer Scrooge. And then what does happen? Well, he sees his past, present, and future, and he changes. He wakes up. It's, what day is it? It's Christmas. And he becomes more generous and those sorts of things. But here's what I want to point out to us as Christians, and I hope not to ruin. It's a great story. I don't want to ruin it too much for us. But here's the reality. No matter how generous he becomes, no matter how much of his money he gives away, no matter how changed his character is because of the visit of these three ghosts, his end is still the grave, right? The ghost of Christmas future is right one way or the other. Now, maybe he goes to the grave a little happier. Maybe he goes to the grave a little, just, but this is what David says even in verse 6. Again, surely for nothing they're in turmoil. Why does it matter if I give away my money, or man heaps up wealth? Why does it matter if I keep my money for myself? Because here's the reality. The greater distance there is in the hope of God, the less hope you have for anything beyond what we see right now. And this is why, again, it's important for us to know the generic hope of the world around us doesn't do anything for the despair of our pain, because it doesn't give us any answer for what's really beyond that end. What could you show us beyond Ebenezer Scrooge's grave that might give him true hope? And so I want us to think about that. How do we as Christians recognize that and say, hey, we need something better than just wishful thinking. We need something better. And that leads me then to our second point in this message. We see the need for hope is the reality that we have to answer that question, what is our end? And the greater distance there is between us and God, the more despair there will be in asking that question. But then I want you to see in verse 7 the thrill of hope. Psalm 39 is kind of like a mountain where you start at the bottom and you come to the top, and the top of the mountain is verse 7. And this is what David says, and now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. For now, O Lord, what do I wait for? My hope is in you. This is what I want us to see this morning. Christian hope is different and distinguished from the generic or general hope of the world in this, that we know who our hope is in. Not what our hope is in, but who our hope is in. You see, what makes David's prayer of despair and pain and discipline and struggle different than the way that the world hopes and wishes is that it's a prayer, that it's relational, that it's him crying out to the God that he knows and the God that he believes in. And it's a reminder to himself, remember my own soul, remember my own mind, that my hope is not that my circumstances might get better. My hope is not that even I could gain more, but like my hope is in you. Those words are so important for us to understand. You see, as we encounter the people around us and we encounter those who are looking for hope in this season, we have to be able to articulate to them that the difference between Christian hope and the hope of the world is that we know exactly who our hope is in. David knows this. He says, my hope is in you. He knows that it's the Lord, Yahweh, which is the relational name of God between God and his Old Testament people. And David says that because of this, he says, we know who our hope is in, and that makes all the difference. Because Christian hope, again, is relational connection between us and the God that we know. But then not only that, we know where our end is. The first part of verse 7, David says, now, O Lord, for what do I wait? He recognizes he exists in a meantime. He exists in a time between what he hopes to come to fruition and what's actually happening around him. But because of his hope being in God, not in some principle, not in some religion, not in some list of rules, not in some feeling of happiness, his hope is in God. He knows that I have an end, that there's a purpose beyond all this, even in my suffering and even in my pain. So I want us to see this morning. The thrill of hope is that Jesus is the one who reveals who God is to us. And because we can know Christ, we don't have to wonder what Christian hope is like. We know exactly what our hope is in. Our hope is in Christ. I want you to think about that word thrill for a minute. That word thrill, the dictionary defines thrill as a sudden wave of keen emotion or excitement. And as you think about that, verse 7 is kind of the thrill, the top of this psalm. David goes from recognizing, man, like life without God seems so pointless and vague and void, and I don't know why I'm suffering, and I don't know where there's pain, to the top of the mountain where it seems like he almost cries out, and now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. I want you to think about that word thrill. When's the last time you had a sudden wave of keen emotion or excitement? Some of us, it was last night. I'm not going to talk too much about that. But I want you to really consider, when's the last time that maybe you were in a beautiful place and you look at the world around you and say, man, this is thrilling. Or maybe you're a thrill seeker. You like to get on airplanes or roller coasters or those sorts of things. I'm not necessarily that kind of thrill seeker. But I want to ask us this question. When is the last time our hope in Jesus thrilled us? Brought about this weight of a sudden wave of a keen emotion or excitement in the fact that we see the darkness of the world. We don't deny it. Like we see the reality of life that's distant from God, but something steps into the story and reveals that there is hope. There is hope. We love stories and movies and all these different things that move us. You think of your favorite movie and everything's broken and despair and nothing's going right, but then in steps the hero of the story, and it just changes your heart a little. Like, okay, the hero's back. The hero's here in the story, and because the hero is here, we can be thrilled. And this is what Jesus does for us. I want us to see that what David knows only in part because of when he exists. David exists before Jesus comes, but David knows that God has made him this promise that one day there's coming a Messiah or a Christ, which means an anointed one. And that anointed one is going to come, David, from your family line. And when he gets here, he's going to be the Prince of Peace and the King of Kings, and the government will be upon his shoulder. This is only the promise that David has, but we know, we can read verse 7 and say, and now, O Lord, for what do we wait? We recognize our hope is in Jesus and what he's done. And that leads me to the third point this morning. We've seen the need for hope, and then the thrill of hope, and finally I want us to see the result of hope. What does understanding that our hope is in Christ do for our everyday lives? How does it impact the way that we think and the way that we live and the way that we act towards one another? I want to point out three things from the text that I hope will help us. Number one, the result of the hope in our life is that we have deliverance from sin. In verse 8, after David gets to the mountaintop of his psalm, he says this sentence in the beginning of verse 8, "Deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool." One of the first and most important things for us to understand about what it means to have hope in Jesus is that we have true deliverance from our sin, from our transgressions. You see, here's why the specific message of Christmas that we as Christians say, yeah, Christmas is exciting because God who created us and made us, we sinned against him, right? We as Christians, we say, hey, we messed this all up. We sinned, but he stepped into our brokenness. That's the message of Christian hope. But the world around us wants the good feelings of hope and the good feelings of joy around the Christmas season without the harsh truth that the transgression is sin is real. That for us to have true hope, something's got to be done about our sinfulness and our brokenness. Well, why is the world so dark? Why is the world so broken? Why do we feel this distress that David talks about? Well, the reality is it's the presence of sin. It's the presence of our enemy. Sin, guilt, our death that's looming over our heads creates the darkness of the world around us. And so the only hope that we might have as human beings is that something can be done about sin. And so this is what David recognizes. He says, hey, I'm in distress. I'm in pain. This isn't fun. This isn't a fun season of my life, but my hope is in God. And so then he cries out, God, you have to do something with my sin. Now, isn't it interesting that David doesn't say, I need to figure this out. David doesn't say, I need to just like the world around us would say, hey, maybe 3 ghosts can visit David, right? David, you just need your ghost of Christmas past and Christmas present and Christmas future, and that'll help you become a better person. But David knows, like, my sin is still there. I still made those choices. I'm still walking in the discouragement of doing this. And so what does David recognize? No, there's no change in my own actions and behavior that can cover up my sin. So what does he say? God, you have to do something about my sin. And David recognizes that he won't be able to fully deal with his sin, but that God can deliver. That word deliver means to save or to rescue. And this is why we have Christian hope. This is what it does in us. We recognize we have been rescued, saved, and delivered from our sin. And the reason that we know that we have been rescued and saved and delivered from our sins is that Jesus himself entered into the emptiness. Here's the Christmas story for Christians. Not that God sends 3 spirits to come tell us our worst things and the best things and what could happen if we'd just be a better person, but that Jesus himself says, I'll come be the substitute in your place. Scrooge, I'll come cover your past, restore your present, and give you hope for your future. I can do what you can't do. The song we sang earlier, that Jesus would enter into our grave. With that vivid picture of Ebenezer Scrooge looking at his grave, imagine for a moment that Jesus comes to us and says, I'll go to the grave for you, and I can come back victorious. We read David's words in the first 6 verses that are so filled of despair. Lord, make me know my end. What's the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. And we think about the reality of Christmas is that Jesus stepped into that kind of world. We like to kind of romanticize the kind of world that Jesus came into. And the reality is, what does Jesus step into? Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they're in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Think about that for a moment. This is the way that David, and you can read Ecclesiastes too. The Old Testament says, hey man, apart from God, our life is just a vapor. It's here one day, it's gone the next. That's the reality. And yet that's the very reality that Jesus physically stepped into so that we could be delivered and rescued for our sins. This is a story of our hope that Jesus sees the brokenness of the world and physically inhabits that broken world, comes and lives as a person who walks around and sees this life full of distress and pain for people and says, I'm going to come so that I can deliver my people from their sin. So we see that in verse 8 that we have deliverance from sin because Jesus entered into our emptiness. But not only that, the second result of the hope that's in our heart is that we find purpose in our suffering. You said, Jared, this seems kind of a weird psalm to preach about Christmas because it has a lot of suffering. But what I want us to see is that the thrill of hope is that the suffering of our life, Jesus stepped into. And because he did, we have hope that the suffering that we now face is not for nothing. It's not just empty suffering. And I want you to see this. Look with me at verse 10. David prays this prayer. He says, remove your stroke from me. I am spent by the hostility of your hand. This is an honest prayer from David who feels God's discipline. And he's feeling the suffering weight of God's hand on his life. And he cries out to God and he says, God, I don't think I can bear this anymore. I don't think I can keep going. In fact, in verse 13, he says, look away from me that I may smile again before I depart and am no more. And I want you to think of the level of suffering David has to be going through to pray, God, you got to stop. You're hurting me. And then number two, God, could you stop looking at me for a minute because your gaze is destroying me. I want you to think about that pain and that suffering. And void of a relationship with God, is that suffering and brokenness meaninglessness? Does it matter? But here's the hope of Christmas, that we have purpose in suffering because Jesus suffered a harsher discipline from God than we could ever face. Look back with me at verse 10. Remove your stroke from me. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Maybe it sounds familiar because when Jesus is going to the cross in the prayer of Gethsemane, what does he say? Father, if possible, remove your hand from me. Remove this cup from me. Yet, not my will, but your will be done. What does Jesus say on the cross? Look with me again at verse 13. Look away from me that I may smile again. What does Jesus say on the cross? My God, why have you forsaken me? In a sense, God, you have looked away from me. So here's the beauty of what happens. Jesus comes, he steps into the emptiness and brokenness of our world, and then he suffers a harsher discipline than we could imagine so that we might have purpose in our suffering. And here's the beauty of what David is recognizing is that though David only knows in part, he is preaching a message about Jesus who will come and take the stroke from God, the discipline from God against sin, so that everyone who puts their faith in Jesus can receive forgiveness and grace from their sins. And so that every person who follows Jesus can say that God looked away from Jesus so he would never have to look away from us. That we recognize the grace in what Jesus did. And here's why this is so important, because what this does for us, it helps us recognize that because of Jesus' suffering, our suffering has purpose. Whenever we feel the discipline of God, whenever we feel the circumstances of our life are not going the way that we would hope or want, the reality is this, that because Jesus suffered a harsher discipline, we now suffer knowing that God is using any pain and suffering in our life only to make us more like Jesus and more filled with grace and more filled with hope. So, the result of hope, number one, we have deliverance from our sin because Jesus entered into the emptiness. Number two, we have purpose in suffering because Jesus suffered a harsher discipline. And then number three, we have a perspective of sojourning because Jesus accomplished eternal peace for us. Towards the end of Psalm 39 in verses 12 and 13, David says, hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not your peace at my tears, for I am a sojourner with you, a guest like all my fathers. Look away from me that I may smile again before I depart and am no more. This is what I want us to see this morning. Part of the Christian hope is a hope that shifts our perspective to help us understand that we're sojourners. You say, what's a sojourner? A sojourner is a person who's in a foreign land, who doesn't have all the protections and parameters of a citizen, right? It's a person who's home for whatever reason they're not there. And David says, that's me. I'm a sojourner. And you say, wait a minute, David, you're a king. You have a palace. You have a whole country, in fact, that identifies with you because you're king. You're King David of Israel. And yet this very King David says, no, I'm a sojourner. Well, why does he say that? Because he recognizes the reality of the brokenness of sin is not where God intends to leave his people. God intends to bring his people into eternal peace. This is why David says, hold not your peace at my tears. David knows that he's not going to find eternal hope and eternal peace until he is finally home with the Lord. And so he has a perspective of sojourning, and you and I can have that perspective as well, because the New Testament frequently talks about Christians as we are a strange people, a foreign nation. We're a kingdom within the realm of this world that everybody can't see. We're sojourners. The New Testament says that Christians are sojourners on this planet. And so why is that important? Because Jesus has accomplished eternal peace. The reality is we recognize that this earth is not our final home. It's so important for us to understand as believers, because the minute that we begin to put our hope in what we can see around us is the minute that we forget the specific definition of the hope that we have in the gospel. The minute we say, but this earth feels pretty good, it feels pretty comfortable, that's the moment that the enemy begins to convince us and convince us that this is all there is anyway, so you might as well enjoy this. But David refuses to believe that. In his distress and in his pain and his calling out to God, he refuses to believe that this is all there is. Instead, he remembers, I'm just a sojourner and I have a better home in the future. If you go read Hebrews and the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, what you'll see that they have in common, we're told by the author of Hebrews, is that they were looking forward to a better home. They were looking forward to a better kingdom. And so here's what we believe about Christmas. Jesus came to accomplish our eternal peace. And in our eternal peace, what he did was turn the world upside down and help us to realize that right now, this life, we are only shadows of who God created us to be. We often think of heaven as this spiritual realm, this spiritual world where we're going to go and just be floating spirits and playing harps all the time and those sorts of things. The reality is that heaven is the world that's real. If you ever have time, C.S. Lewis, a Christian thinker, he wrote this short story. It's called The Great Divorce. And in this short story, he admits this is not a great theology of heaven and hell and purgatory. It's a story. It's an allegory. But in his allegory, the character who's having the dream or the vision is on his way to heaven. And he gets to heaven, and what he recognizes, he was in kind of a purgatory state before he gets on this bus. It's really interesting. But he gets to heaven, and what he recognizes is all the people he saw as so real on the bus to get there now look like ghosts. They're transparent. They're walking around. And in fact, they get to heaven, and heaven's grass is so hard that it hurts the ghosts to walk on it. It's so real and tangible. He tries to pull a daisy, a flower out of the ground, and he says with all his strength, he can't pull it through. Why? Because what he's trying to tell us in this allegory is that what we think of is you get to heaven, and that's where you become the ghost. But in reality, because of what Jesus has done, this is the realm in which we exist as shadow. What we really are and what we're called to be in the glorified state that Jesus promises us, that's what's real. That's our hope. That's our peace. And you get in the story in C.S. Lewis, and what he says later is that everything that's real in this world only becomes more real in heaven, and everything that's a lie and deceptive in this earth fades away into the reality of what it means to be in perfect peace with God. When Jesus came to the earth, the idea was that he was the Prince of Peace as the Messiah and the Anointed One. And sometimes we have this idea in our head that peace exists as someday we're just going to all get along. And when in reality, the way that Jesus accomplished his peace was by going to the cross. And he goes to the cross to rescue us from our sin, to give us purpose in our suffering, but ultimately to earn an eternal peace that we're one day looking forward to. And so it's important for us to see that as Christians, for us to be able to distinguish our hope from the world, we have to have the perspective of a sojourner. We have to have the perspective of someone who's traveling. And there's a difference, right? If you've ever been to a foreign nation, you know that there's a difference between being a visitor and being a citizen. And this is what God challenges us to think through as Christians, is the reality that we are citizens of Jesus' kingdom and travelers in the world around us. And what that does is shifts our perspective. It shifts what we put our hope in. It shifts what we see as real and valuable. So, the result of our hope, deliverance from sin because Jesus entered into the emptiness, the purpose in our suffering because Jesus suffered a harsher discipline, and then a purpose and then perspective of sojourning because Jesus accomplished eternal peace. I want to invite the praise team to come now, and we're going to walk into a time.